Good evening and welcome to the JFK Jr. Forum. My name is Mark Guerin. I'm the director here at the Institute of Politics, and we warmly welcome you to really kick off our forum's coverage of election 2020. This evening, we have four outstanding national political reporters who are joining us. So we're delighted to have you all here, and we look forward to your questions. In a special way, we welcome the college class of 2024 as you begin your journey here at Harvard. We wish you all the very best. We hope you'll be engaged in the Institute of Politics, attending forums, working with our fellows, and all the range of programs that we have. So we welcome you to campus, to Kennedy School students as well. We look forward to your engagement with the activities of the Institute of Politics. But tonight, as I said, we're fortunate to have four national reporters who know Harvard well, who know the Institute of Politics well. Two graduates of the college, Phillip from CNN, and Alex Burns from the New York Times, and two former resident fellows, Margaret Talev of Axios and Dan Balz, the chief correspondent from the Washington Post, who continues as our senior fellow. So we're very fortunate with Dan's expert moderation to have the three journalists discuss election 2020. It's been an eventful few weeks after the Republican and Democratic conventions. As we look to the future with the debates, presidential and vice presidential debates, the key states, and so a real chance for all of us to gain their inside perspective and their insights into this critical election. As I said, this really starts off our election 2020. This will be a big part of our framework for this semester, as you would imagine. Next week, we have two important forums, one with Andrew Yang, the former presidential candidate, offering his perspective on the race and some of the policy ideas he advanced on Tuesday night. And then on Thursday, we will welcome this year's fellows at the Institute of Politics, Chasten Buttigieg. We will have Carol Giacomo from the New York Times editorial board, former journalist, Jorge Vasquez. We'll welcome back Brittany Packnett Cunningham, Mayor Michael Nutter, the former mayor of Philadelphia, and Alice Stewart, the conservative communications advisor to candidates. So it's a great group of fellows. They will be here in the forum on Thursday. But tonight, with our gratitude to Abby and to Alex and Margaret and Dan, we welcome you back to the Institute of Politics. We wish we were all in the JFK Jr. Forum at 79 JFK Street, but we do look for your return to that venue, but we are very grateful that you joined us in this way. Dan, thanks again for moderating.
Mark, thank you. Let me just add my welcome to everybody. It's great to have everybody on this Zoom. We will be all virtual this semester at the Institute of Politics, but things will be very busy. There's a lot of programming that we are in the process of planning and already have planned. And so we hope that those of you who are not familiar with the IOP will check back in regularly, and those who are familiar will find your way back in the way you have in the past. We are at focus this year will be on, for this semester, will be on the election. I mean, so much of our programming and content will be built around election 2020. And that's the topic tonight. I mean, we've been through two unconventional conventions. We are now heading into the final 60 days of what is likely to be a tumultuous, to put it mildly, election. This is being called the most important election in our lifetimes, and I think that's said without any real exaggeration. The candidates are out on the campaign trail in a way that they haven't been, particularly Vice President Biden. He was in Kenosha, Wisconsin today. The president will be having a rally in Latrobe, Pennsylvania shortly after we finish up tonight. We will be then very soon beginning early voting in some states, and that will accelerate as we go from late September into October. The debates begin on September 29th. There'll be three presidentials and one vice presidential. I believe they end around October 15th or thereabouts, October 22nd. And so there is much to talk about tonight. And I'm thrilled, honestly, to have the three journalists who are with me tonight. They are the best in the business, seasoned political reporters who have covered campaigns with distinction. Again, Margaret Talev from Axios, Phillip from CNN, and Alex Burns from the New York Times. I want to start out with what may be an obvious question, but I think it's important to kind of set the scene and set the tone. I go back to the point I just made that this is the most important election that we've all gone through. Alex, can I ask you, how do you describe the stakes of this election and how they compare with what we've seen in the past?
Well, first of all, thank you for the introduction, and thanks to Mark and to all of you for tuning in. It's always been a thrill for me to return to the IOP in any fashion. It meant the world to me as an undergrad and continues to. Whatever I paid for with the quality of my senior thesis because of my time commitment at the IOP was entirely worth it, and I've not regretted it for a day. Having said that, this is my sort of third and a half presidential election as a reporter. But when I was a freshman, when I was watching my first forum, it was the fall of the election between John Kerry and George W. Bush in 2004. And the stakes of that election felt quite high as well. And so did the stakes in 2008, which was unfolding in the middle of a global economic meltdown. So I do think it's important to just sort of contextualize that it always feels like the stakes are apocalyptic for one reason or another. I do think that we hear the candidates themselves and the supporters of the candidates and just your average voter in the street talking about the stakes of this election in different terms than we've had in the past. Because when you listen to the conventions that we just heard, and I think particularly the Democratic convention, particularly former President Obama's speech at the Democratic convention, none of us in our lifetimes has seen a former president of the United States talk about the very survival of democracy being on the ballot. That is the kind of language that you hear in other countries that are younger democracies or more historically unstable democracies. It's not the kind of thing that we've typically heard in the US. And you've not typically heard, or really, again, ever in my lifetime, heard an incumbent president talk about attacking the legitimacy of an election the way this president has. So the stakes are existential, sort of whichever angle you approach this from. And I do sort of wonder how much that affects the debate we hear over the next 2 months, because on the one hand, the stakes are immense and in some respects greater and more abstract than elections that we've seen in the past. The survival of democracy is not just a matter of what your tax bill is going to be at the end of the year. But at the same time, for most voters, they're grappling with very, very concrete challenges related to the pandemic and the economy. And so for me, for the next 2 months, I think trying to figure out the interplay of those two forces, the world historic stakes of the election, and then the very, very concrete and immediate, and in some respects, more ordinary stakes of the election, but no less urgent stakes of the election for your average voter. I don't think we have any idea how those forces are going to play out in conflict or in tension or in sort of mutually magnifying ways.
Abby, let me turn to you. Before the convention, the pandemic was clearly the overriding issue in the campaign and on the minds of people. But the president used his convention to drive a law and order message, and he has followed that up with lots more talk about law and order and the way he sees cities burning and the consequence of that. To what extent has he been able to change the conversation about this election or around this election? And how is Biden dealing with that?
Well, the president, because he's the president, obviously, he has a lot of power to really determine what we talk about on a day-to-day basis. I also think it's been magnified because he has been so active in the midst of the pandemic. He's been traveling, so he's been setting a sort of narrative through his actions about what he wants to talk about. And so it's really been an overriding message since George Floyd, since Lafayette Park, when he cleared protesters in order to walk over to St. John's Church to hold up a Bible in front of it. And so we've had actually a long time to get a sense of how this is working, if it is working at all. And yesterday and today, I think between the 2 days, we've had an enormous amount of polling. And I've been kind of scouring the numbers to just see what's going on with the law and order message, what is going on with voters' priorities in terms of what they care about and what they don't. And the polling kind of all tells the same story. The first is that people still think the economy or the coronavirus are the top two issues for them. By and large, whether you're looking at national polling or you're looking at state by state polling. And then when you look at criminal justice and policing, you look at law and order, you look at public safety, I've honestly been a little surprised to see that Biden is outpolling Trump among voters about whether or not they think Biden can keep them safe, whether he is better on the issue of law and order. So, you know, as a political reporter, that's a little surprising to me because I do think what we've seen is that when President Trump starts to champion an issue, he moves Republicans very strongly in that direction. And he has moved Republicans in his direction on the issue of law and order, but it has not been enough to overwhelm Biden's advantage or overwhelm the other factors. So I think it's been interesting that this message seems to, frankly, based on where we are right now, I'm not convinced that it's working as well as perhaps the Trump campaign thinks that it's working. On the other hand, it is to your question, the dominant narrative, so much so that I think that the Trump campaign successfully pushed the Biden campaign to go to Kenosha, to go to Wisconsin this week in a way that they probably didn't want to have to do. And Biden is now having this conversation that Trump wants him to have, but he's trying to have it under different terms. So, you know, there's still time left for these feelings to sink in. But I do think that the data that we have up until this point really suggests that this issue is not rising high enough in terms of people's priorities. And I think one of the reasons why is because there are other things. The coronavirus and the economy go hand in hand. People see the virus as tied to their economic fates in the short term and in the long term. And I think it's going to be very difficult for the president to overwhelm that by just simply talking about law and order, especially when, you know, the facts are crime is still at a 25-year low in the United States of America, even with increases that we've seen this year. So the idea that somehow the United States is being overrun by crime is just not something that people are actually, the vast majority of Americans are actually living through. I think that also makes it more difficult for that argument to stick.
Margaret, let me follow up on that with this question about Biden. He does seem to be somewhat buffeted between his very solid base in the African-American community, which is vital, obviously, to his hopes of winning the presidency. He needs not just the big margins that he can expect, but he needs big turnout. We know that there is softness among younger African-Americans, particularly young males. At the same time, he's got to worry about the strong support he has among white women in the suburbs, that doesn't erode. And he's also trying to, certainly those upper Midwest states, pick back some of the white working class voters that defected or that have been with the Republicans for a while. As you have watched him over the last week, how do you think he is handling that? How do you think he's feeling the pressure of trying to, in a sense, talk to different audiences about the same topic?
Sorry, Zoom fail. Thanks, great question. And hi, everyone, welcome back to fall semester. Look, I think President Trump, President Trump too, Joe Biden has clearly shifted since the primary and since the conventions in terms of how he's messaging and how he's presenting himself. As you know, his career in the Senate began in 1972. He always kind of prided himself as a slightly left of center centrist, but I mean, he was the pragmatist who could reach across the aisle and find the place for compromise. That was certainly out of fashion in the primaries, and he had to set it back. And he's, not just for political reasons, but I think means it, has taken much more of a leaning in position in terms of social justice and reforms in the wake of George Floyd and a number of terrible things that have happened since the pandemic, including the pandemic and its disproportionate impact on race. But here's where the rubber meets the road in terms of cold, hard politics. it's not a national election. It is an electoral college election. And the demographic shifts and tipping points that have already occurred in population centers, and the largest, some of the largest of states, places like California and New York, they're not at that point in Wisconsin or Pennsylvania. And so I think we've seen Biden in the last few days realize that he needs to define himself or be defined by President Trump. And when you have President Trump coming out and saying things like, that there's people in dark clothing on unidentified aircraft, or that people don't want to be raped or murdered in their suburban homes, that's something that obviously Biden has felt like he needs to answer. And so threading that needle between saying, look, I'm for treating people equally and giving justice to people who are, unfairly targeted including by law enforcement, but at the same time saying, I'm not for violence or, violent protests. Like, that's obviously the message he's trying to juggle. And it's complicated because you don't want to look like you're flip-flopping or trying to make everyone happy. But on the same token, we're seeing in our, we just did a focus group out of Wisconsin, and it's a focus group, it's not a poll, but what we learned from that focus group, these were predominantly voters, swing voters who had been with Barack Obama in 2012 and then voted for Donald Trump in 2016. And consistently, what we heard from them, almost entirely white voters, one Asian American voter, was that they don't like the way the Democratic Party talks about racial justice, as if people of color are the only ones who get treated poorly by police or don't have systemic advantages. They don't like the rhetoric. They don't, if you use the word structural racism, a lot of those voters, they don't think that's a thing. They don't accept that that is just a thing. But if you ask the question differently, if you say, like, is it fair for someone to be, shot in the back? They'll answer the question differently. So feeling that that everyone gets a shot at a better life, that it's not just things that are aimed at people of color and overlooking working class whites. It's a very complex thing to message. And that's what Joe Biden now, I think, is having to do in the last 2 months.
Alex, let me pick up on something that Abby referred to, which there's been a slew of polls that have come out this week. Priorities USA, which is the Democratic super PAC, did a briefing yesterday for reporters, and one of the points that was made was that, well, this is actually a pretty durable race, or a reasonably stable race. How do you read it at this point? And particularly as people are, being inundated with polls, what are the sort of cautions you would offer people as they try to interpret this number, that number, this state, that state?
Yeah, it's tough. I would say that, I'm as much of a polling junkie as anybody, and I love to dig through the very specific crosstabs on one poll and then the very specific crosstabs on the poll that comes out 3 hours later that says something substantially different, and take it all very, very seriously in the moment that I'm consuming it. I think that generally, as a consumer of polling information, you should use it to get the broad strokes of the race, not the really fine granular details until we actually know how different counties and municipalities voted, and we can sort of match it up to polling data and say more specifically what happened. If you see one poll that shows that Joe Biden is leading by 20 points with Hispanic voters in Texas, and another poll that shows him leading by 12 points, like, I would not put that much weight on the difference between them. So similarly, I don't personally find it all that important in doing my job to parse the difference between the polls that have come out in the last week that show Biden leading by 6 points nationally and the polls that show him leading by 9 points nationally. The point is that he's leading, and it's a substantial lead. And it might not be a landslide lead, but it's a substantial lead. Same thing in the swing states. We know that he has a substantial lead nationally, and that it appears to be a smaller lead in the swing states. Not clear whether it's half as big or 3/4 as big or narrower than that. I think for a political reporter, it's not all that important to know exactly what the answer to all of those questions is. In terms of just parsing the larger picture of the race, I do think it's been a pretty stable race. I think that part of why people have this sense that it is shifting in a significant way right now is that we had that set of polls in June and July, including by the New York Times and the Washington Post, that showed Joe Biden with just an out of this world kind of lead over the president nationally and in the swing states. And I think that everybody, including those of us who wrote up the polls at the time, thought, this is not going to last, right? We don't live in a country where people win national elections by 12 points or 13 points. That has not happened in my lifetime. I don't expect it to happen in my lifetime. And, crossing my fingers that will be quite a while yet. So I do think that, it is always a more stable race when you have an incumbent president, that people have pretty much made up their minds about that person. Doesn't mean that they can't change their minds, but part of the reason why folks in the media are focusing so much on voters like the ones Margaret was talking about is because they seem like they actually could still change their minds in one direction or another. There are not a whole lot of those people left when you have had a president for 4 years. I think there's even fewer of them when you have a president like this one, who has been so polarizing from the start and who has really not tried to change people's minds about him. So the question to me is really what happens on the margins with turnout and participation, which a couple people have alluded to, and then what happens with the voters who did change their minds between 2012 and 2016, and not just the Obama to Trump voters, also the Romney to Clinton voters, or the Romney to Gary Johnson voters, or the Obama to nobody voters, that people who participated in the past didn't participate the next time. How does Joe Biden juggle his appeal to those people, and can the president deliver a kind of message? And I do think this is what we're seeing him do right now. I do think this is what the movement in the polls reflects. Is he delivering a message that is basically about reassembling the coalition he had in 2016 and just trying to squeak this one out again? Because right now we're not hearing anything from him. We're not seeing anything in the polling that suggests he is reaching people who were not already pretty open to his message.
Can I pop in on this
Sure.
one, Dan? Just because I think I concur with everything that Alex just said. And I would add that one of the big differences between this cycle and 2016 is that, unlike Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden is not a candidate who has unfavorability ratings that are as high. Voters do not feel as negatively toward him as they did toward her. And so I do think that there's potentially a dynamic here where you have some Romney voters who sat out in 2016 or who voted third party in 2016 who come back into the political process. And what does that do to the math? I think the math for Trump in 2016 was threading a really fine needle. Some of it was Obama voters who sat it out. Some of it was Obama voters who flipped over to him. And then some of it was, voters who decided to vote third party because they couldn't stomach him. I think that's a really hard formula to put together again. And now there's this added dynamic that he's no longer running against a uniquely sort of a popular type of political figure. And they've worked really, really hard to push up Biden's negatives, but it's proven to be a very difficult task. And I think it will continue to be for them, but it's the most important task, I think, for the Trump campaign. It's to drive those negatives on Biden up as much as they possibly can.
There's also another huge difference between, and I totally agree with everything you just said, but there's another huge difference between this year and 2016. And that's the percentage of ballots that are going to come in by mail, absentee and early, but in some cases early means late, really could have a huge impact on the count, on legal challenges, on rejection rates. And this is not a guarantee, it's just a possibility, but there is a possibility that will impact the results to an extent comparable to how turnout affects results.
And by the way, people are voting right now, or they will be in a couple of weeks. So,
Yeah,
you know,
tomorrow.
yeah, I mean, people say, like, you know, obviously election day hasn't been election day per se for a long time, but we've never seen anything like what we will see this cycle, in which people have to turn in their ballots at a minimum 14 to 15 days before election day in order for them to count. That's going to be millions and millions and millions of people this year compared to previous years.
Let's talk about what that might look like. Margaret, you did a piece this week about something called the Red Mirage, which is what election night and the days after might look like, and what that might spark. Could you talk a little bit about what that is, and then let's go broader than that about kind of the contentiousness of this entire election, and what may be in store as we get to election day and after?
The Red Mirage is obviously a super provocative term coined by a group called Hawkfish, which is a Democratic strategy and modeling firm that Michael Bloomberg founded. So there's the bias disclosure there. These are Democratic strategists trying to have the impact of getting Joe Biden elected. But what they did is they built this very complex model that took into account polling, 6 weeks worth of polling of like 17,000 people, a bunch of national and state polling averages from 538, historical data on ballot rejection rates in different states that vote where absentee and vote by mail exists, and what we know to be true consistently from all polling, which is that Democrats are more afraid of catching or spreading coronavirus than Republicans are in this country, and that in part because of that, as a result, we're seeing Democrats ask at much higher percentages for absentee ballots, the ability to vote by mail this year. And so the expectation is that disproportionately the vote by mail will comprise Democrats, and disproportionately voters who vote at the polls on election day itself will be Republicans. What does that mean? Potentially what it means is that if you were to somehow just take a snapshot of the votes that had been counted on election night, it would disproportionately favor Donald Trump. And if you were to see that on a map under this theory, it would look red. But that it wouldn't really be as red as it looked, and therefore it would be a mirage. And that in the days that followed, or potentially weeks, depending on what happens, that map would get bluer and bluer and bluer as more of those vote by mail ballots were counted. Under their modeling, that scenario goes from Trump red on election night to Biden blue after maybe some period of 5 days. I have no idea if that's what's actually going to look like, nor do we know for a fact that that election night will favor Donald Trump. It's in theory possible, if Florida were to be a runaway state for Biden and some other states, that actually we know on election night where Biden stands or have a clearer picture of it. We don't know, but what we do know is that there's consensus that between election night and whatever day the race is finally decided is going to be a powder keg of tensions and likely challenges from both parties to try to maximize their standing and minimize their competitors' standing. And what Democrats are concerned about is that the president, because he controls so many levers of incumbency in red states, will be applying intense pressure on elected or party officials, everyone from secretaries of state up and down the line, or judges, to find in his favor. Again, it's speculative, and I've talked to many Republicans this week who hate this story because they think it's basically Bloomberg and Democrats trying to gaslight Trump and preemptively delegitimize a win if he wins. I've talked to liberal Democrats who hate this idea of a story because they think that it's waving a white flag of surrender before the election even happens and telling Democrats they shouldn't bother to vote. But as I see it, it's actually neither. It is an attempt to look systemically at what the data tells us about how coronavirus and mail-in balloting have set certain trends in motion that we've just never grappled with before. And it makes the election in 2000, which came down to one county and one state, look like a warm-up act for what we could see.
Alex, putting aside the reasons why people on all sides hated the story that Margaret wrote, to what extent do you worry about a chaotic finish to this election and therefore even worse division, no matter who wins, than we have seen in the run-up to the election?
I guess I'm not sure worry is the verb I would use, because I think that's almost certain to happen, right? So to the extent that worry indicates uncertainty, I don't have much of that. I think it's very concerning for the country that the great likelihood is that the election will be followed by a period of disorder of some scale. If Biden ends up winning fairly convincingly, I'm sorry for if you hear some ambient noise, but I have a dog that's getting a little bit agitated as we speak. If he wins by some convincing margin, I'm not talking 10 points, but if he wins by, 5 points, which is not a historical kind of margin for somebody to get. Barack Obama got 4 points, 4-point margin in 2012, which was, we think of as a close race. Maybe it's simpler than all this. But people spend a lot of time, and I understand why, speculating about what will happen if the president refuses to accept the results of the election. I think we ought to spend maybe not just as much time, but plenty of time thinking about what happens if things go the other way and Joe Biden wins the popular vote by a decent margin, but the president wins in a couple Midwestern states by a minuscule margin of victory. And you once again have the majority of the country, or a plurality of the country in the case of the 2016 election, could be a majority this year, being asked to accept being governed for another 4 years by somebody who most people did not vote for. And for that outcome to happen a couple months after we saw what was probably the largest mass protest movement in American history, it's not really hard to imagine a Trump victory being followed by a scale of public resistance that would dwarf what we have seen in the wake of previous elections. I do want to say I did not hate Margaret's story, but I do think that one thing that, from my own experience with the Bloomberg data operation covering that presidential campaign, his folks can get very committed to one specific scenario. Can sound very confident, very convincing about one specific scenario. And I don't think that Margaret got taken in by that one specific scenario, but I do think that people have a way of getting locked into, I remember very well, I guess this was last early November, being told by the Bloomberg people that, their data folks had run the numbers. And if he didn't do the daring and self-sacrificing thing of running for president, then the party would surely nominate Elizabeth Warren or perhaps Bernie Sanders. And I guess we don't know if they were right, because he did do the daring thing of run for president, and it is sort of the Heisenbergian, to participate in the phenomenon is to change it. But I think that this is, I think Margaret is right, that this is one scenario that we should think about. It's not the only scenario. And the fact that there's so much uncertainty about how the mail-in voting will play out and how voter turnout in general will play out, I think is something that we all have to keep in mind and just be enormously humble on election night about the conclusions that we start to draw.
Yes, that Bloomberg theory worked until Bloomberg met Elizabeth Warren on the debate stage, and things changed slightly for his for his prospects. Thank you all. I'm going to now move to the questions from our audience, and I will tee them up one by one. And the first one is from Mina. Hi, Mina.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for talking today. I wanted to ask you all to touch on a part of this election process that could be consequential. That is the debates between Biden and Trump, as well as between Harris and Pence. I wanted to see what you all think in terms of the impact that the debates could have on the election outcome. Do you think it'll be significant? Do you think the way that Trump debates and the fact that Nancy Pelosi discouraged Biden from debating Trump and likened it to skullduggery will impact Biden's ability to both kind of fend off Trump's attacks, as well as change the public perception of how adept or skillful Biden is at being able to kind of stave off somebody who's known for being very aggressive in his manner of speaking?
Abby, you want to try that one?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think that the debates will matter. I think particularly the very first one, because as we've just been talking about, people are going to start voting very quickly. come October. And so you're going to see a lot of people making up their minds. I mean, in some of the polling, like 9 out of 10 people say that they are pretty certain where they're going to go. So the window of opportunity for these candidates to change minds is very narrow this year compared to past years. And the dynamics of a debate with Trump are always very tricky, because if you remember back in 2016, it seemed as though Hillary Clinton won the debates against Trump. And ultimately, it didn't really, obviously didn't change the outcome the way that she would have liked. So, I think that we should be cautious that winning the debate or being perceived by the media and even by a majority of the public as winning the debate doesn't necessarily mean that some people won't vote for President Trump. But I think that so many of the narratives that the Trump campaign are trying to establish about Joe Biden really require them to be face-to-face with him. One of them is what we've talked about, the crime and justice, law and order type of message, which really, I think, has been hard for the Trump campaign to prosecute, because they haven't for a long time had a lot of engagement from the Biden side. And so I think when they have that engagement, they will feel like they have an opportunity to make their case more clearly. But obviously the other big thing is going to be stamina. And it has been beyond me why the Trump campaign really wants to push on this issue of, Biden's mental acuity and stamina or what have you. But I think that if they want to have that debate, not debate, but if they want to have that conversation, the debate stage is going to be a really key place for that to be on display for the American public. I don't know what people are going to see in terms of, whether they think that one 70-something-year-old or another 70-something-year-old has the stamina to be president, but it's going to be, I think, a big part of that narrative. And, as far as Pelosi is concerned, I kind of read her comments as an attempt to troll President Trump into debating by sort of saying that, Biden shouldn't debate Trump. I don't think that the Biden campaign found that to be helpful, and they also don't necessarily agree. But I think that it was more kind of aimed at getting under the skin of the Trump campaign, because, President Trump, even while now they're arguing for more debates sooner, several months ago, they were making the case that the debates were going to be unfair regardless of when they were held. They were complaining about the debate moderators. They were complaining about the format, and it all signs seemed to, and he was also saying explicitly that he would consider not attending debates. So it's really been the president that has been kind of questioning the value of debates. And so now it looks likely that they're going to happen. The very first one is going to be the most important, because really, like, people are voting. There's going to be early voting and there's going to be mail-in voting. And once those ballots are cast, in most cases, that's it. In some cases, you can change it, but in most cases, that's the end of the story.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Mina. Next up is Jessica.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Dice Singh. I'm calling from Bentonville, Arkansas, and I'm a junior at the college, formerly in Winthrop House. But my question was kind of in regards to something that was mentioned before of some of the top two issues have been the economy and COVID. And so what do you guys think the impact a vaccine for COVID will have on the election, especially with how it's been politicized, with the CDC releasing that announcement of vaccines coming out November 1st? And like, what do you guys think about that?
Margaret, you want to take that?
Sure. I mean, look, President Trump is clearly trying to send a message that coronavirus is basically over with now, and that a vaccine is, weeks away and everyone's going to be fine. And he's doing that explicitly by literally what he says, and he's doing it in kind of more intuitively by not, doing these large events where people are sitting right next to each other and not wearing masks, and he's doing it by trying to pivot to a crime message and away from the virus message. But I think the latest, the push and the pressure to get at least a infrastructure for vaccine delivery out there before November 3rd, and tossing even the vaguest rhetorical possibility that it would be broadly available to Americans by November 3rd is kind of like the cherry on top. Do I think that we're all going to be like lining up at CVS on Halloween to get COVID vaccines? No, I don't, but I'm not a scientist. But I think the strategy behind that is obvious. And I've probably just exhausted my knowledge on the subject. I'll yield to Alex.
Alex, what do you think?
Well, I certainly don't have much more knowledge of the science of vaccine development than anybody else on this panel. But no, I think Margaret's absolutely right, and I think that one of the things that we have seen consistently throughout the COVID experience, if you want to call it that, is that when the president starts to recommend something or promote a certain kind of policy, public moves against it. That there is a very low level of trust in his judgment and in his honesty on the subject. The last time we did polling, the share of people who said that they thought the president was a reliable source of information on the coronavirus was substantially lower. I don't remember the exact number, but it was lower than his share of the vote. So there are people who are voting for him who said that they were not. They did not see him as a trustworthy source of information on the coronavirus. I say all this as by way of, if the president were to say on November 1st, head to CVS and take the vaccine, I think a lot of people would take that as sort of a blinking yellow light that like maybe don't go do the vaccine just yet. And I think that's potentially an enormous public health challenge, either for the Trump administration if he is reelected and has to distribute the vaccine, or a Biden administration if he comes into office with this shadow of doubt having already been cast over whether the vaccine that the government is asking people to take really got the kind of road testing that people expect from the vaccine.
Go ahead, Abby.
Sorry, not to belabor this, but I can't emphasize enough how we should not assume that a vaccine being available around the election or before the election would benefit the president. To Alex's point, confidence in vaccines has been going down, not up. Confidence in the president's handling of coronavirus also going down. I do wonder if something like that could really become something that signals to a lot of voters that there is undue political influence and actually drives them to continue to view the president's handling of this crisis as insufficient. I just think that the idea of a virus being ready before people have trust in it, that it is safe and effective, could backfire in a way that is unpredictable in this cycle. And it should not be assumed that that is automatically a good thing for the president, because he's not in a good place in terms of handling this crisis. And you will start to see actually a lot of Democrats doubting, I think, the value of a vaccine. I almost feel like the public health community should probably come out and kind of have a rule almost like, the FBI was supposed to have a rule about doing investigations within 14 days of an election. Like, I don't know that there's like really any benefit to doing anything dramatic when it comes to something like a vaccine just before an intense political cycle, because the impact of that is going to be very unpredictable. It may not benefit the president, and it could have like serious long-term consequences for public health.
The other timing variable for this, and this may be a salient point for this audience today, is the return of school, both at the grade school level and at the university level, for the universities that are attempting to come back and do it in person or partly in person. And I think just because of the coincidence of timing, schools going back around Labor Day and it taking a while to see who's sick and if and how it will spread, is that we have the potential for some volatility in case rates and infection rates in the coming weeks, which nobody wants that. I don't, as much as I enjoy thinking about political modeling, that is not a model that I want to be thinking about, but it is a fact. And there are two trends between now and Election Day that could have an impact on how people vote. And one is the virus and how it impacts Americans, and the other is the economy and whether it moves up or down or stays the same in the weeks to come.
Just a quick point on to Alex's point. I think our last poll on trust on the president on the issue of coronavirus, I think it was 64% said they did not trust things he had to say. So next we will hear from Victor.
Hello, my name is Victor. I'm a sophomore in Courier House, and I'm currently Zooming in from Lake Tahoe, California. So my question is for Abby, but I'd love to hear from the other panelists as well. But seeing as you've covered instances of mass American tragedy before, both in Charleston and in San Bernardino, we saw recently in the middle of the Republican convention, the shooting that took place in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And I'm curious to have your take on that, especially seeing as this was committed by a 17-year-old who appears to have taken this rhetoric that we've already discussed of a law and order by the Trump administration to heart, seeing that he's also been photographed in the front rows of a lot of his rallies. So my question is, do you think that this is going to shape some of the conversation, the dynamics moving forward? And maybe for Alex, who's also covered the Trump campaigns before, do you feel as though this is something that will warrant an address in some way or a potential pivot within the Trump campaign for how they are going to address law and order moving forward as well?
Hey, Victor. First of all, I'm very jealous that you're in Tahoe. I wish I were there. You know, I do think last week it was so surreal, honestly, to be in a studio covering the Republican National Convention as like Kenosha was just becoming this incredible tinderbox, and two people had just been shot and killed, and we were just learning about who was responsible for it, and just watching, frankly, the lack of acknowledgement at the convention about those events that had occurred. And I do think that right now the Trump campaign strategy is simply to ignore it for the time being. In conservative circles, this young 17-year-old who shot and killed 2 people and injured a third is becoming a sort of hero figure, which is extraordinary. And, I think that, let's put it this way. I do think that in as much as, reporters felt like they missed the story of 2016, these voters who were so dissatisfied with the system that they kind of went over to the Trump side. I do think that we do need to be careful that we don't over extrapolate from that, because there is what happened last week in Kenosha. There is what happened over the last couple of days in Portland, where a group of armed individuals, many of them supporters of the president, were shooting paintballs at protesters. One person was killed. There is a dynamic of conflict that is unfolding in these situations between the president's supporters and between protesters. And it is a question to me whether that actually, in fact, plays positively into a law and order message. And I think that the president's campaign, I think they think that they can simply just recast it and ignore the death and recast it as just a symptom of anarchy in Democratic-led cities. But I do think that the American people are going to be a little bit more discerning than that. They see what is going on, and the reality of that situation is conflict. So I do think that that dynamic is a tinderbox that's going to get worse. I don't think it's going to play necessarily in the way that that maybe the Trump campaign thinks it's going to play, because the reality is this is happening right now. Americans have consistently viewed the president as an instigator of racial tensions, an instigator of a certain type of chaos and division in the country. And I don't necessarily see any reason to believe that somehow 3 months before an election, that's going to change. Suddenly Americans are going to think that he's going to bring the entire country together. It's just, it just doesn't pass the smell test. So, I think that these conflicts are, it's a big deal that people are getting killed on the streets. in conflict with one another. I think we've become numb to it, but it is a big deal. I think Americans recognize that, and I think it's going to have an impact one way or another. But the president says this is evidence that, on American streets, a Democratic leadership is failing. But I think many Americans actually do not think that he is helping in terms of bringing the temperature down, bringing the rhetoric down, calling his supporters off, discouraging people from showing up in the streets armed. And I don't think we should somehow think that the public is not able to discern reality from fiction based on what they're seeing happening on the news every single day.
Alex, do you want to pick up on the other part of Victor's question?
Sure. I mean, I think I would say where the Trump campaign is concerned, the president doesn't backtrack on his support for people who he sees as on his side. So I would not expect to see some big pivot about the shooting in Kenosha or the law and order rhetoric generally. And this has been a consistent feature, an extremely consistent feature from the start of his candidacy, that he's, to the extent that the American people are worried that the president uses the language of incitement, it is not a concern that the president himself has ever acknowledged or acknowledged valid or allowed to shape his behavior. I do think in the world of Republican politics more generally, outside the Trump campaign, or even within the Trump campaign, of people who recognize that their messenger is who he is, and you can only do so much to change him, but who are cognizant of the limits of his appeal. There's absolutely a recognition that this is a country that has historically responded to a message of law and order. It is not a country that has historically responded favorably to what they see as extremism of any kind. So that's the danger in the approach that the president is taking, is that he is trying to talk to a combination of his own hardcore base to get them fired up and reconsolidated after a really politically rough season for him. But he's also trying to talk to voters who don't support him already. And if he can persuade some share of moderate or center-right voters in the suburbs that this election is a choice between your neighborhood being safe with Donald Trump and your neighborhood being burned down with Joe Biden, then maybe he can shave off enough of those votes, and they're almost all white votes, to win the Electoral College again. But what he can't, if the choice that he ends up presenting, or that Joe Biden convinces the country is before them, is a choice between essentially street warfare with the president on one side and bringing the country together, or lowering the temperature overall, I don't think that's a debate Republicans think they can win. So we'll see how far the president goes in that direction, whether he goes far enough that anybody else in his party says, you know what, man, you need to knock it off.
Our last question will come from Alex Chan.
Hi, thank you so much for coming today. My name's Alex. I am a sophomore in Lowell, and I'm zooming in from New York. I guess my question for you is if you think that there's a secret Trump vote, that the polling is not picking up, people who might not want to admit to a pollster that they support Donald Trump, and how this will affect the election, if it will.
Who wants that one?
I'll just answer it really quickly. I
Okay.
do not. I don't believe that there is any evidence that there is a shy Trump vote at this point. I think that you could make the case that there were social dynamics at play in 2016 that made that some kind of factor. But right now, I think you're getting this weird mix of arguments that Trump supporters are far more enthusiastic than Joe Biden supporters, far likelier to show up on election day, so enthusiastic that they support the president in vote parades, and also that they're a little bit uncomfortable stating their support for the president. I think that that's not really a coherent theory of the Trump electorate. I think it's a different thing to say at this point that you are for or against the incumbent president of the United States than to say 4 years ago, when he was seen as such an underdog and really such a far out candidate in a lot of ways, that actually you were going to vote for him. It's absolutely possible that there are people out there who do not admit to a pollster that they are going to support the president. I just don't think we have any evidence to think that that's a larger share than the number of people who, just don't answer the phone when they call, or maybe they don't want to say they support Joe Biden because they're in a historically conservative community where they're surrounded by Trump signs. So I think we got to watch that space with some degree of skepticism. I think the real phenomenon there that maybe is worth watching is called differential non-response in polling. That when one party gets depressed, that sometimes their voters just answer the phone less or are less inclined to take an opinion poll. So if you see Joe Biden's lead open up again to 13 or 14 points, or if you see it narrow down really abruptly and in response to, it's not really clear what forces, that might be a real shift in the race, but kind of wait to see that it holds up over time before assuming that it's something permanent and not just people who have seen the president or his challenger do something that embarrasses and demoralizes them and makes them feel like, I actually don't want to talk to somebody from the Washington Post or the New York Times or CNN or Axios about this.
I think that if it came down to the exact same states that it did last time, you may not call them you don't have to call it a secret Trump vote. You could just call it people who are genuinely, and again, mostly white voters who are genuinely undecided about whether they should be more worried about coronavirus or crime. Trump's caught their attention. Maybe Kamala Harris seems sort of like an unknown quantity to them, and they're worried about Trump's messaging that Biden would just be a puppet for other people. Like, I think all that stuff could be causing enough uncertainty that even if they're not secret Trump fans, that they could just be people trying to make up their mind. But I will say this, and I know we don't have time to delve into it. Maybe we can do it in another Zoom. There is another school of thought that says it will not be exactly the same map as it was in 2016, and that there are places like Arizona or, Florida, which would be total game changers and change the dynamic. So I think, I would never predict what's going to happen 2 months out, but those are some of the reasons why I think it's very hard to predict it.
Thank you all. I want to close with a question for each of you and answer it as succinctly as you can. But I think for all the students who are tuned in tonight and are thinking about either a path into politics or a path into our profession, into journalism, what should they be thinking about? I won't say what advice would you give them necessarily, but what should they be thinking about as they look with some interest in either of those paths once they finish up at Harvard? Abby, you want to go first, and then we'll do Alex, and then we'll end with Margaret.
So I think there are a lot of things you can do, but I think that one thing that turns a lot of people off from pursuing politics as a career, or political journalism as a career, is feeling like you don't have interest in the horse race or the kind of, the who's up, who's down. And I think for those people, I would strongly encourage you to persist, because I think increasingly journalism, political journalism, needs to be reliant on people who are strong analytical observers of the public and of public opinion, and not just through polling, but through people's actual lived experiences and their perspectives. Because right now, I think we're still living through and a political realignment, which causes some of the data that used to be so sort of like hard and fast relied upon in the political world to be a little bit less useful to us. And so to the extent that you can spend your time really thinking about how can you listen more to what voters have to say, and how can you try to understand more where people are coming from on both sides of the issue, and the complexity and sometimes the idiosyncrasies of voters. People don't necessarily vote in a linear fashion. They have opinions that take them in different directions, and understanding how that how that works. It's a listening exercise more than a prediction exercise. And I think that I would really urge you to spend more time, reading those kinds of stories that give you a window into people's thoughts and their thought processes, as much as you spend time reading about polls or spend time reading about political strategy, which I think a lot of times these days relies on some flawed habits from old cycles that may not actually even be relevant in the realignment that we are living through right now.
Alex?
I agree with everything Abby said. I would just say three things real fast. One is that I think it's very useful in politics or covering politics to have some engagement with a discipline other than politics, to have grounding in some craft or expertise that is not purely political. And that could be literature, it could be statistics, it could be chemistry, but I would take the time to ground yourself outside just this one world, in addition to working in this one world. The second thing is that if you do feel the pull of public service or political activity or journalism, don't let your friends or your family or a McKinsey recruiter talk you out of it, just because it is safer to go in a different direction. When I took my first job out of college as a research assistant with Politico, I was told by some people that Politico would not exist in a year. And I was told by other people that it would have been safer to go into consulting or investment banking. And 3 months later, the financial sector completely collapsed. So my bet turned out to be the safer one, at least in the short term. And just the last thing I would say is that if there are people who are watching, who are students, who are interested in going into journalism, please do feel free to reach out to me directly. I'd be very, very happy to be a resource to you. I benefited enormously as a student from mentors, mainly through the IOP, who helped me figure out my path into this field. It's really hard to figure out sometimes what the right angle of approach is. And I think all of us who have benefited from mentors in the past, it's enormously important for us to pay it forward.
Same goes for me, and I'm sure for Abby. I hope anyone will reach out by email with questions. It's easy. It's margaret@axios.com. I guess my advice would be have the courage of your convictions. Listen more than you talk. Listen first. I think you need to think about if you're trying to decide between the two right now, I think you need to think about whether you have strong partisan leanings or a strong activist leaning that would compel you to take action, or whether you are more interested in being kind of a referee or an observer, an honest broker of the process. That will probably determine which of the two directions you initially go into. But I will also say this, that if you go into politics first, or if you go into consulting or investment banking first, there is still a place for you in journalism. It may not be as a mainstream news reporter, it may be as a columnist or a host of some kind of convener. But some of the most interesting, smartest people in the journalism world beyond reporters are people, whether it's Sanjay Gupta or whether it's David Axelrod, or whether it's anyone from either party or no party at all, people who actually know something about the field that they're speaking in because they have worked in it, can be very effective communicators and arbiters of sort of discussions. So it's been a great pleasure to spend an hour with you guys tonight, and I hope you all stay in touch.
Thank you, all three.
Dan, are you going to answer the question?
I will. I'll just briefly answer it. Alex, I think your point about grounding in some discipline is vitally important. The one that you did not mention that just I would focus on is history. A reading of history and a consistent reading of history will hold you in good stead. This is a rapidly changing country, as we all know. It's obviously a divided country. Our politics reflect those changes rather than vice versa. And anybody who has an inkling of going into politics, this is a vitally important time for people of goodwill and good sensibility and the right values to get into the political arena in some way or another. There is a lot about political campaigns that turns people off. But there is something vitally important about the debates that go along with an election that shape the future of the country. And for those of you who are, who have some, interest in the activist side, think of it in all the good ways, not in the kind of the destructive ways that we sometimes see. And for people who, want to understand what's going on, journalism is a great place from which to practice it. We have the opportunity, that the old cliche, we write the first rough draft of history, but it's more than a cliche. I mean, we do get an opportunity to try to write the story of America as it's unfolding. And this moment in our history is so rich in so many ways that if you have any inkling of interest in doing that, I urge you to do it. And as everybody said, I'm certainly available for anybody who wants to tap into, my background or, my thoughts or advice or whatever. My best email is dan.balz@washpost.com. And so I would welcome you. Margaret, Abby, Alex, thank you so much. I really appreciate your taking the time tonight. This was a great conversation. Remember, for all of you who are tuned in, there are 2 forums next week, Andrew Yang, and then the new group of fellows for the IOP, the Fall Fellows contingent. I hope many of you will be able to join for one or both of those. So with that, thank you very much and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Good night.